Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this AFRY webinar on the benefits of long-duration energy storage in the GB market. I'm Gareth Davis, a director in AFRY's Policy and Regulation practice, and with me this morning is my colleague John Perkins, lead author of AFRY's recent research report for UK government on this topic. I'm also delighted to welcome two members of the BEIS team responsible for developing policy in this area, Matt Aldridge, Head of Electricity Storage, and Rhys Oliver, Smart Energy Analyst. So Matt and Rhys will contribute to the Q&A and will also provide an update on the process later in the webinar. So just a few pieces of housekeeping before I hand over to John. Please ask any questions throughout the webinar using the question panel that you can see, and we'll cover as many of those as we can at the end. And noting that some people have already raised questions during the registration process, and we'll capture some of those too. And finally, the slide pack and recording will be available on the AFRY website after the webinar. With that, I will hand over to John to lead us through the initial presentation.
Thanks, Gareth. So as we approach this topic about long duration storage, we start with the context of the net zero target there is in GB for reaching economy-wide net zero emissions by 2050. And when we start to think about what that system is going to look like, we see that it's very likely that a net zero target will create the conditions where storage is more likely to be beneficial to the system. So the UK net zero target implies a huge expansion of capacity and generation from intermittent renewables. And this transition away from a fossil fuel dominated system to a weather driven generation mix will mean that the electricity system looks very different to today. So we'll see much more variability in the supply of power and increase in the need for flexibility across multiple different timeframes. And we've just got an example of that on the right here from the modelling that we did in our report. So looking at an example of 2050 generation mix for a couple of weeks in January, based on a particular weather pattern, we see that you get prolonged periods of excess generation and also prolonged periods of deficit of generation caused by the movements in weather systems and the relative output of wind turbines at different times. We also see that the system will have much larger variations in daily patterns due to evolution in demand, evolution in how that interacts with solar as well. So there's a need for storage and flexibility to deal with this intermittency at different timeframes. And along with that, there's also other needs for storage as well, potentially, with a reduction in synchronous traditional thermal generation. It increases the need for system services. And with much of the new renewable generation expected to be located far from the large demand centres, this is also likely to exacerbate network congestion issues. And putting all of this together means that net zero systems are likely to be ones where storage is beneficial. Now, whilst there's been a strong growth in the pipeline for short duration lithium-ion batteries, the outlook for long duration storage has remained much more uncertain. And with that in mind, the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy commissioned AFRY to quantify the benefits of long duration storage. And our report has been published alongside the government's response to their call for evidence on the facilitation of deployment of long duration and large scale electricity storage. And what comes out of this is that there's a large variety of technologies, each with different flexibility characteristics, with this long duration capability that is looking to come forwards in the coming years. Whether that's traditional pumped hydro or liquid air storage, compressed air storage, various forms of battery with different chemistries, and hydrogen storage as well. And in the responses to that call for evidence, one of the themes that emerged is that there are significant barriers to the deployment of these technologies at the moment. So whilst they may be beneficial to the system, because these technologies are typically capital intensive, have long project lead times, and have few contracted revenue streams available to them, there are barriers to their deployment. And it was in light of this context that BEIS asked AFRY to investigate the role of storage in a future GB system. So the question that we were tasked with answering is, what would the impact of long duration storage be on system costs, and also to answer a series of associated research questions on the future needs of storage for net zero. So what AFRY did is we replicated BEIS's own scenarios within our BID3 model and our own modeling framework. And there are some key differences to the BEIS DDM model. So the AFRY BID3 model has got a full 760 hourly resolution. It covers multiple weather patterns instead of sample day modeling. It has a co-optimization of the power and hydrogen sectors, so both are considered together and the relative synergies and trade-offs between them. And we also have an 11-zone approach to transmission constraints within the electricity network. And so we're able to explore some of these issues around network congestion and how storage may be beneficial. In order to answer that primary research question, we modeled a range of scenarios with 2 cases each time. So we modeled a short duration storage only reference case, where the only storage technologies that are available are the short duration options. And then in comparison to that, we modeled an all durations case, which included both medium and long duration technologies in the model investment decisions. And by looking at the differences between these 2 cases, we were able to quantify the benefits and see what reductions in system costs are possible by the deployment of longer duration technologies based on the input assumptions that were made. So with all modeling, it's worth understanding the context and the caveats. So in the report, we've only modeled a subset of the possible scenarios and a subset of the possible storage technologies. So the focus was rather more on the services that might be required from flexible storage technologies, rather than a detailed examination of all the different technologies that might be needed in the future. Obviously, a lot of these technologies are relatively new, and there's a lot of uncertain about future storage technology costs, as with a range of other technologies that may be needed for net zero. And AFRY only modeled a set of technology investment costs that are consistent with BEIS's central view on costs. The model also assumed that there are price signals for efficient delivery of these investments, and it creates economically rational outcomes. And the core scenarios assumed that there would be no locational constraints associated with the transport of hydrogen around the country, which is an important assumption to understand, which was tested in some of the sensitivity analysis that we did. So the core scenarios assume that as the hydrogen sector emerges, that transport of hydrogen would be created alongside that sector scaling up. And a final caveat is that the study was performed prior to the 2035 net zero power sector targets, which was announced partway through the analysis. And the 2035 emissions in the modelling therefore reflected the 6th carbon budget level for the power sector rather than the stronger targets. And you might expect that if we had included that target within the modelling, then the need for more low carbon flexibility in the 2030s would have been stronger, and it might have had an important influence on the modelled results. But with those caveats and contexts in mind, we can start to look at some of the results. And the headline result that we found is that up to 25 gigawatts of medium and long duration power storage plus 15 terawatt hours of hydrogen storage can reduce system costs by between 13 and 24 billion on a net present value basis out to 2050. So we expanded the definition of different types of storage beyond BEIS's definition of large scale and long duration storage. And in our results, we presented things on the basis of short duration, medium duration, long duration, and hydrogen storage. The short duration option being up to 4 hours, medium up to 12 hours, and long duration power storage of over 20 hours, and hydrogen storage in a category of its own. And on the right here, we can see some of the scenarios that we modeled and the capacities that resulted in 2050. So in the first scenario that we modeled, in that reference case where the only short duration storage options are available, we had around about 45 gigawatts of short duration storage in addition to the existing pumped hydro. And the system, therefore, was reliant on this short duration options, but also flexible low carbon generation in order to meet those extended periods of low wind output. And in this scenario, without the hydrogen storage, it was principally a lot of gas with CCS that was included in the overall capacity mix. Then when we move into the all durations case, we see that a significant quantity of medium duration storage technologies are included and deliver reduction in system costs compared to the reference case. And in this all durations case, we also had that hydrogen storage coming forwards to facilitate the integration of electrolysis and hydrogen CCGTs. Then in the third scenario, this was a scenario where there was a de-risking of investment in long duration storage options through policy support. And what we see here is that there's a further deployment of medium duration and long duration storage options. We also examined some sensitivities that included a greater deployment of long duration storage technologies. And what we found is that in each of these cases, there was a reduction in system costs compared to that reference case of only short duration storage options. Final sensitivity presented here was an important one around technology risk. So this was a sensitivity where some of these emerging technologies like CCS are much harder to deploy and their capacity was limited, and also some of the costs around hydrogen transport and storage were increased. And what we found in this sensitivity is that it strengthens the need for power long duration and medium duration storage options to mitigate the risks around some of those emerging technologies. So overall, we found that these benefits arise because storage can provide low or zero carbon security of supply during those extended low wind periods. It can facilitate a faster reduction in unabated gas, avoid the curtailment of renewables, avoid and delay the need for transmission network reinforcement, reduce exclusive reliance on shorter duration storage alternatives, and provide an alternative to those immature or emerging technologies such as gas with CCS and mitigate the risks around those emerging technologies. What we saw is that these different services that storage is providing exist in different categories. So in our analysis, we thought about the kind of services that storage may need to provide, and the characteristics of the system will lead to different technology solutions. And the benefit of storage is that it can offer cost savings by offering bundles of multiple different services. So in high level terms, we examined how there's a need for flexibility in different categories, whether that's maintaining system stability, balancing supply and demand at different timeframes, or easing constraints in the network. And for each of these different categories of service, there's a range of different potential flexibility solutions. And it might be that there are some options that are relatively cheap within each of these different categories. But the question is whether there are storage options that can contribute across multiple different categories and therefore offer cost savings by offering those bundles of multiple services. And what we found in our analysis is that towards the top end of the diagram here, there's more strong competition and there's more technologies available that can offer those services. But as we look down towards the longer durations, we see that there's relatively few competitors to long duration storage, and long duration storage is therefore able to offer real value to the system. One way that we see that this emerges is through analysis of the kind of patterns that in residual demand that are likely to emerge in 2050. So what we've done here is just pull out some examples of that from our modeling, and to look at the patterns that will likely exist in daily residual demand and weekly residual demand in a highly renewable dominated system. So when we talk about residual demand, this is taking the final consumption and subtracting from that the available renewable generation. And the positive values indicate a deficit of generation, and the negative values indicate that there's an excess of renewable generation. And what you can see here is that as we move towards 2050, we get more volatility in the residual demand, and there will be days with stronger excesses, but also lots of days with an excess of renewable generation caused by that massive expansion in renewable capacity. And these trends contribute to the volatility in the residual demand that in turn provides a signal for technologies that can respond to these swings in renewable generation. In particular, in a wind-dominated system, as we expect GB to be because of the offshore wind, but also the strong onshore wind potential, we find that with weather systems that move, wind weather systems that move relatively slowly across the country, we find that there are sustained periods of excess and shortfall that you can see in the bottom chart here. So weeks at a time where there's an excess of generation and weeks at a time where there's a deficit. And this can be filled by a range of technologies, including long duration storage, but also we found that these deficit periods can be so long that it does also signal that there's a strong need for flexible low carbon thermal generation that could provide the number of terawatt hours that's required across a sustained 2 or 3 week period with low wind output. But alongside those flexible low carbon options, our modelling demonstrated that there's a significant benefit to the system in having a range of different storage, long duration storage technologies available. Another aspect of the modelling focused around the ability of storage to bring benefits to the transmission network. And with our modelling on a zonal basis of constraints within the transmission network, we found that storage solutions can help reduce the total costs for transmission network reinforcement and also mitigate some of the deployment risks. Now, all of the technologies that are likely to feature in a net zero system require varying levels of supporting infrastructure. So, for example, those flexible low carbon options such as gas with CCUS, they will require today's gas infrastructure, but also a CO2 network and sufficient CO2 storage. Some of the hydrogen technologies also have very complicated infrastructure needs to facilitate them. They might not need the gas and the carbon infrastructure that gas with CCUS might need, but to deliver the benefits identified in the scenarios, they would also require a hydrogen transmission network. And what this really highlights is that hydrogen storage is a bundle of different technologies that require effective coordination. And it's not as straightforward to deploy, therefore. What we also saw is that power storage solutions typically don't have the durations to remove the need for transmission network reinforcement in total. And we found that without reinforcement, many storage options may become sterilized behind long constraints far beyond the duration of the storage. But from the scenario results that we've pulled out here, we can see that storage technologies can mitigate the deployment risks and minimize curtailment in addition to optimal reinforcement of the transmission network. So again, looking at those scenarios that we presented previously, in the case where there is long duration storage available, the total spend on transmission network CapEx was reduced in those scenario 1s and scenario 3 cases where there were all the different durations available. And so greater deployment of medium and long duration technologies can help reduce the required transmission network spend. On the right, where we have the technology risk sensitivity again, and also a sensitivity where we explicitly prevented the transportation of hydrogen between different zones, we see that there's much greater spend required on the transmission network. So where the hydrogen can't bring benefits to the power sector to the same extent, there was a higher investment in the power transmission network required. So what this really highlights is that with all of these storage options, there's a need of coordination from a whole systems perspective. Then finally, in terms of presentation of the results, I want to highlight how the report showed that supporting long duration storage is a low regrets decision. And this emerged from the results because long duration storage technologies have the ability to mitigate the risks around some of the emerging hydrogen and the CCUS options. So in those core scenarios where we ignored the risks around the delivery of these new technologies, what we saw for 2050 is that based on current cost estimates, there was a strong need for these flexible low carbon thermal options that will fill those production gaps in extended low wind periods, producing those terawatt hours of power that will be needed on those days. And this could be gas with CCUS, but the modelling showed that with hydrogen storage, that long duration hydrogen storage, it can reduce costs. However, when we focused in around the time frame between 2030 to 2040, we found that there's significant risks around the deployment of these emerging technologies. And with the tighter timeframes to 2035, if those solutions don't deliver, there's a risk of much higher costs. So without CCUS hydrogen and power long duration storage, the system will be stuck with a combination of short duration storage and potentially also unabated gas on the system. And this means that there's material value at risk and also making it harder to meet the emissions targets. So looking at the system costs out to 2040, we've got here from scenario 3, the short duration storage only case, and compared with the long duration or the all durations case, we can see that between 2030 and 2040, there is some benefit in terms of reduction of system costs through the introduction of medium and long duration storage technologies. However, when we compare this to the technology risk sensitivity, where the CCUS and some of the hydrogen technologies are much harder to deploy, what we see is that there's significant value at risk. So without those emerging technologies, if there's no decision taken to incentivize power long duration storage, then the system would be much more expensive out to 2040. So what we see from this is that support for long duration storage taken now to reduce the risks around its deployment, to incentivize it being brought onto the system. The result of that is that it can mitigate the risk around these other emerging technologies and mitigate this potential for additional costs. Now, across the scenarios, we saw that around 3 gigawatts of power long duration storage in that greater than 20 hours duration category would emerge as a low regrets decision for investment today, in addition to substantial quantities of medium duration storage. But we also saw that in some of the sensitivities, there was a need for much more power long duration storage as well. And what this can do is it can provide that necessary flexibility ahead of these emerging technologies scaling up and mitigate any potential delays around transmission network reinforcement in order to integrate the required new renewables. So in terms of the presentation of the modelling that we've done, that's a summary of the report that is available online. But we'll now have a time of question and answer, and I'll hand back to Gareth in order to lead that.
Thank you, John. That's really good overview of the analysis that's been done in a short time. I'll encourage us, many of you, if you haven't already read the full report, there's a lot more detail in there, and please go and read it. But now I'll turn to some of the questions that we've had already, and please feel free to keep adding questions as we go through. I think the first question that came through, so storage providers can access quite a wide range of revenue streams. So how do you see the relative importance of those changing over time?
I guess I'd say two things primarily in response to that. I mean, the first thing is that in this report, we looked at it from a system perspective, and the focus was on the services that are required rather than the markets where the value for those services emerge. But when we think about the different revenue streams, I guess two things I would say. So firstly, not all technologies can provide all services. And so where there are services required, where there's a lot of different technologies that can provide that service, it's likely to be more competitive and more likely that the value erodes in that value pool over time. Because of the competition from a greater variety of technologies competing for that value. But where there are technologies that can provide multiple different services, then they're more likely to have a revenue stack that stands up over time. So then the second thing would be around market depth. So if the first point was around different technologies having different capabilities, then the other point would be around market depth. So some services are required on a national level, and the markets are relatively deep. And sort of focus around the balancing mechanism at the moment for provision of short, fast flexibility would be a case in point of a market that's much deeper than, say, the frequency response markets. But also with some of these points around services for constraint management, where there's a locational element of the service, being able to locate an asset in the right location and be able to offer a service that other assets around the country would not be able to offer would also be an indication of having an element of the revenue stack that's likely to stand up relatively well over time.
Thanks, John. Rhys or Matt, is there anything you'd like to add on that at this point in time?
From my perspective, I think we're all aware that the services themselves, well, the markets themselves are going to evolve over the time period that we're looking at, and therefore kind of looking at this in more detail, actually trying to understand those markets per se, I think would be incredibly difficult task to try and do through this modelling. Obviously, what we're aware of is long duration storage can act in multiple different services. However, we've also got to take into account from the kind of more system perspective, which of those markets would we prefer long duration storage to operate in, and therefore also kind of bring in that consideration. So yeah, obviously that's going within our analysis going forward of where can we achieve that greater system value for the storage assets.
Great, thanks, Rhys. The next question I've got, and it links in with more than one question actually, is one which is slightly more generic. Are there other emerging technology solutions that you haven't directly assessed within the modelling that may affect the conclusions of the study? And that sort of links with, there's a much more focused question that's come through as well, which is there a specific reason why molten salt storage systems haven't been investigated? But I think that broader question is as to what range of technology or other technologies are we aware of, and how does that change the results?
Yes, obviously within the study we didn't model every possible storage technology, but focused on a smaller variety that represented a reasonable range in the possible technologies out there. Within the modelling, a focus on the services that will be required rather than different technologies. Where there are other technologies out there, obviously, if they are cost competitive, then they would bring greater benefits. I think in the case of some of these medium duration storage technologies, it's likely in the short term that in order to be competitive, they'll need to be chasing the cost curve around lithium-ion technology. So as we start to see medium duration lithium-ion battery solutions, other technologies may need to be competitive with lithium-ion capex. If there are other technologies out there in sort of the longer durations, I'm aware of some we haven't considered. There's types of battery, whether that's iron or vanadium, that didn't feature in the modelling, where they can offer really long durations, then they could potentially be competing with some of those flexible low carbon options and bring further benefits, particularly in that context of the technology risk around some of those hydrogen solutions. And I think the other in all these technologies, that it's quite uncertain what will emerge, but I think some of the programs that BEIS have been doing to incentivize and help with the scaling up of new technology options are really important in that context. And I don't know if Rhys wants to add anything more on that.
Yeah, I was just going to flag, I suppose, on the long duration energy storage demonstration project. So this is being led through the Flexibility Innovation Fund. So from a BEIS perspective, we're wanting to encourage the best technology that there is possible for the system, and therefore putting money to try and develop those for kind of use later down the line. I think it's more, we're not taking a particular technology driven approach, more of a tech neutral. So trying to find what are the kind of services, what are the characteristics that we would want from the longer duration storage assets. And therefore, if other technologies can meet that, then yeah, if they're cost competitive, then I think we would be fully supportive of that.
Great, thanks, Rhys. And as we're talking on innovation, the questions come on about a technology solution that's there in the Australian, Sunshine Hydro is developed in the Australian market that deploys what they call a super hybrid, and whether this has been considered for sort of future modelling in the GB market. And I assume that any new innovative technologies are things that BEIS would be sort of like wanting to see come forward into this space.
Yeah, I'm not aware of the particular technology that's used to that. But yeah, obviously, if we can, if from the initial analysis, this would be something that we would want to explore for the UK, then yes, we would absolutely want it to be incorporated within that kind of future analytical work that is undertaken.
The next question is starting to get into a bit more detail here. Are there specific locations where long-term storage is either more likely or more valuable?
Yes, I'm not. I guess the question could be taken in a number of different ways. I mean, in our modelling, some of the long duration storage technologies we assume would only be deployed in certain locations. So hydrogen storage relying on geological salt cavern storage, there is a limit to where that can be deployed, and so there's a question as to whether it's beneficial to have it in those locations. And what we showed in our modelling is that in order to realise those benefits, you might need to have some hydrogen transmission between where it might be nice to put the electrolyzers and where the long duration hydrogen storage is available. But in terms of where storage may be beneficial, obviously the transmission network around Scotland has been very congested in the last few years, and there's a lot of interest at the moment in building new storage options in Scotland. What we see in our modelling at the moment is that there's potential for some of those Scottish constraints to get very, very overloaded and have thousands of hours a year where there are constraints binding on those sort of northern Scottish and northern English boundaries. And if those constraints are of such long durations, then it can be a challenge for some of the shorter duration storage solutions. But in theory, it should be possible to place storage strategically around the country where there are transmission constraints, and to use it to absorb the excess renewables behind those constraints, whether that's Scotland or around some areas on the East Coast or otherwise. And I think it's a really interesting question as to what technologies might be best placed to do that. And that depends on the extent to which those constraints are going to be extending for 6, 12, 24, 48 hours, and whether there are particular forms of storage that may be more beneficial if the constraints are going to become that significant, or whether the network reinforcement is able to keep up a little bit more in the future, and therefore provide more of an opportunity for shorter duration storage options behind transmission constraints to provide those benefits. Which didn't answer the question at all, but I think the point is that it's not as simple as saying I'm going to put a short duration storage option behind a transmission constraint.
Thanks, John. I was going to move on briefly to a slightly different question. A lot of discussion here has been around or the role of hydrogen. And one question that's been raised is, what's the advantage or the reason for modelling a pure hydrogen network and storage solution compared to alternatives such as synthetic methane utilised in the existing gas network?
Gosh, good question. I think around the hydrogen sector, it is very uncertain what actually emerges, and there are some really big policy decisions that need to be taken, and whether that is a repurposing of the gas transmission network, or whether it's possible to integrate these synthetic fuels into the gas transmission network, I'm not an expert on that topic. In the analysis that we did consider some sensitivities where an explicit cost of building a hydrogen transmission network was incurred, and we considered the differences that emerge in the system and the relative benefits of long duration storage that there are in that case. And I think what it highlighted is these points around coordination of the infrastructure needs are really important, and in the discussions around a future system operator, they'll need to take a whole systems approach to this and consider what is possible with the existing network and what other infrastructure will be needed to complement that. But in terms of the extent to which synthetic fuels can be used in the existing gas network, I have to come back to you on that one. Obviously, if you can use the existing infrastructure to a greater extent, then it would save some costs.
Matt, Reece, have you got any further comments on this that you'd like to make? I mean, I'm conscious that obviously within the modelling we are also taking as given certain elements of hydrogen demand and implementation of sort of the UK hydrogen strategy. So there's already a sort of an underlying rationale for developing a sort of the hydrogen system. But is there anything? Has that been, to what extent has these alternatives been considered or are being considered within the sort of the policy debate?
Yeah, I think I can answer that one for you. The thing is, with Carbon Budget 6 and all of our net zero goals and targets, and a net zero energy system or electricity system by 2035, and then an export system by exporting energy by 2040, which is the new current government goal. I think it's quite clear that we're going to need lots of everything on the system, and all of these solutions provide answers to those questions of how are we going to be able to reach net zero, turn this into an export potential, gather growth from this, as well as keep bills down for individual consumers. So when it comes to the policy consideration going forward, we are deeply thinking about the way the system will run in the future through the REMA project, but also we have alongside us hydrogen as an ecosystem, which is going to be used in many parts of the energy system, being developed alongside us. The role for hydrogen within the power sector is, I think it's safe to say there's going to be a role for hydrogen in the power sector, and like your analysis has shown.
I think we may have lost Matt for a second.
Come back to him.
Yeah, okay, unless Reece, was there something you wanted to add?
Just on the back of that, I think we're all aware that hydrogen has many uses, and therefore it's also where best placed across the market should that hydrogen be used, and therefore the extent to which hydrogen will be used in the power sector compared to, let's say, decarbonising industry or something along those lines, that I still think there's quite a bit of uncertainty around that, and I think there's uncertainty in general about deploying hydrogen at kind of quite the scale that's potentially needed. and therefore this is how we also see kind of long duration storage potentially coming in to also act as that almost risk mitigator as well. So again, it's not potentially relying on too much of one technology, having that diverse portfolio available, so you're not banking everything on one. So yeah, we're absolutely looking at the kind of what is available as a whole in the market. And as Matt was saying about especially with the focus on kind of growth and exporting energy under the new government, then yeah, I can only see this increasing.
Yeah, thanks, Reece. We've got another, I mean, linked in with that, there's another question that's come in, which is on this area, which is saying the analysis obviously seems to put a large weight on hydrogen electrolyzers becoming economic. And, you know, I think you partly answered this already, but to what extent does the analysis fall down if electrolyzers can't be made to work cheaply and efficiently? And John, do you want to pick that first?
Yeah, so I think if we start with looking at what 2050 looks like, so we showed some examples in the material that we presented. There's a question as to what technology is going to fill those low wind periods in 2050, and how the excess wind extended periods are also going to be managed. And yes, electrolyzers, based on the cost assumptions and the modeling assumptions that we made, were a key part of that. Without them, then there's other options that are available for providing the terawatt hour a day, let's say, over a 3-week period. What are the other options? Gas with CCS is another key low carbon option, as would be other technologies like nuclear or BECCS. And within that context, also long duration storage. And some of the long duration storage options will undoubtedly be able to provide very long durations. So compressed air solutions, it is possible with the right geological formations to get a month of storage in a compressed air solution. And some of these flow batteries talking about 100+ duration solutions. So there's a range of different technologies that are available to fill those gaps. But for me, what it comes down to, there's a need for terawatt hours of scale. And one of the reasons why, not only cost, but one of the reasons why hydrogen emerges as such a strong contender within the modeling is because it's possible to get those terawatt hours of hydrogen storage more cheaply than it is possible to deploy tens and tens of gigawatts of various different battery options.
Reece, do you want to?
I was just about to say on that, I think it's worth highlighting again that within this analysis, we only use the central BEIS figures on the hydrogen costs, as in the hydrogen technology costs, and therefore, yeah, we're aware there is wide uncertainty that wasn't tested within this modelling. The kind of availability of hydrogen was more looked at, but obviously when you put in the cost, it would have different impacts in terms of the benefits to the system and the potential reliance on long duration storage or other storage assets compared to others. I think what's important though is again the multi-use of the hydrogen that is coming in here. So one of the things that we're relying on, I suppose, is the hydrogen is going to be used on multiple different elements, and therefore it's creating that market around the hydrogen itself as well. So because it can be used in so many different things, there is that market, there is the incentive to invest in it. So that therefore drives down costs and things like that. So it's almost it's a self-fulfilling prophecy to some degree, obviously not completely, but I think that's one of the key things as part of this, because it has so many different uses around, and it's creating that demand for it, which then drives down the price, as we have seen for other technologies. Once there is that kind of push for the technology, the costs do fall quite dramatically.
Yeah, thanks, Reece. We've got another question just come in, which is very similar. Has longer duration energy storage as an enabler of very low cost electricity for electrolyzers at constrained wind farms being considered in this study?
Just to make sure I've understood the question, has electrolyzers located with constrained wind farms been considered as a potential storage option? I think that's what the question was. Maybe that's the question I'll answer. Yes, exactly. So in our modelling, we had our 11 zone model of the GB transmission network with modelling of those key transmission constraints that exist. And what we see in the results, and is highlighted in the report, is that there's potentially enormous benefit if you can make the hydrogen sector work. Then potentially enormous benefit from locating electrolyzers north of the B6 boundary in Scotland. If there's the relevant infrastructure, then to get the hydrogen from the wind farm to the locations where there's hydrogen storage available, the salt caverns in Cheshire or Yorkshire, and then linking that up with either CCGTs or the industrial clusters in the north. There's potentially enormous benefit in doing that, and that's highlighted in the report.
Thanks, John. We've got one more question, and which I will probably pass to Rhys, maybe, given that Matt is not on there, which is, how can you secure a long-term revenue stream for energy storage solutions?
So obviously, as I'm sure many people on this webinar are aware, it's something that BEIS is actively looking at. We're aware of the particular issues when it comes to long duration, whether it's revenue stacking or just the kind of high initial capex of some of those technologies, and therefore they need that kind of assurance going forward potentially on their investments. So again, pointing towards the call for evidence that came out, we put forward a set of potential options and kind of asked our stakeholders to have kind of their views on that. We included things like cap and floor. There's also the wider REMA work that's going on. But it's looking at these as a package, I think. So we have to have something that's the right balance between kind of assuring the investment, but also safeguarding consumer bills and making sure that it isn't completely one way or the other. There needs to be that balance, and I think especially for long duration storage, it is providing that kind of risk mitigator and that added assurance in the market. As we'll go on in a second, it's almost the next phase of this work is to develop these options of how we can support long duration storage coming online. We know it could be an incredibly useful technology to bring online, and therefore developing those options is how we could support it under the appropriate mechanism. Or yeah. Thanks,
Rhys, and yeah, I think you've sort of highlighted. I think at this stage, we have one more question, which is where can we get a copy of the report? The report itself is available both on the sort of the BEIS and the AFRY websites. When we put the pack together and make it available after the webinar, we will make sure we put a direct link into the report for people to be able to access. With that, I think that's been sort of really interesting Q&A session. Some very good questions coming up, and some interesting suggestions for what might be needed next in terms of some of the further modelling, and maybe leads us on right at the end to what are those next steps, and to pass over to Rhys, in the absence of Matt, to just outline where BEIS is going with all these issues around long duration storage.
Yeah, sure. So as I think it's clear, we're actively seeking a kind of appropriate business model to support long duration storage. In the British energy security strategy, we highlighted that we would develop an appropriate policy to enable investment in long duration storage technology by 2024. And I think this has been the clearest commitment that there's been so far on this. So we obviously see that there's a need for it, and when we put out the call for evidence, most respondents highlighted that some kind of mechanism was required to bring their investment forward. We know from the kind of pipeline of projects there is kind of significant capacity that could be coming down the line if there was the kind of most appropriate investment support for them. So there's kind of three main things that we need to do to take this forward. So as you see, I suppose, with the analytical outcomes from the AFRY model, while there was a strong foundation there to support long duration storage, the kind of amount and scale, I suppose, so the scaling characteristics, I think it still needs to be explored further. So especially when you look at the locational aspect, so do we need to go into further detail around exactly where these storage assets could be best placed, and therefore what storage would be most appropriate for them. Also looking at things like the technology costs a bit more, because this is a whole system perspective that we need to look at this for. It's looking a bit more the relationships between kind of CCUS and hydrogen, and a bit more of the scenarios around that, and therefore the role that long duration storage can play in that. So we will need to undertake further analysis on this. What we're also doing is conducting kind of a final assessment on potential interventions here. So I mentioned REMA earlier. I think the consultation closed yesterday on that. Obviously, we want to have something that works in tandem with the REMA options that are taken forward, so the review of energy market arrangements, I believe it is. We're working quite closely with that team to make sure that there's coordination across the piece, because obviously there's some quite significant options that are being explored. And what we don't want is there to be a situation where there are potential stranded assets or anything like that. So yeah, working in tandem with that team. But also we're working with Ofgem as well on the development on the appropriate investment mechanism. So this will also go into the delivery of whatever mechanism that is as well. So that will be the stage over the next kind of year and a half that we're kind of taking that forward. And I'm sure you'll be hearing more from us on refined and more fleshed out options that I'm sure will go back to stakeholders.
Thanks, Rhys. That's a really good overview, and I suppose that sort of says watch this space. But it's good to know that policy development is sort of proceeding, and also it's being coordinated with some of those wider developments that we're seeing or anticipating coming in the electricity market. With that, I think it falls to me to thank you all for attending, to thank John for his presentation, and particularly thank Rhys and Matt from BEIS for participating in this webinar. I think it's it was BEIS gave us the opportunity to undertake some of this analysis, and it's good that that we had them through all the way on the process. If you need any more information, then please feel free to contact either myself or John. And just to flag for those of you who are interested, The latest episode in the AFRY Fueling the Transition podcast series is now available on the AFRY website, and it's with Nick Eyre, who's Professor of Energy and Climate Policy at the Environmental Change Institute here in Oxford, and it's on discussion around energy demand and energy efficiency. So thank you very much for attending. We look forward to inviting you back to future AFRY webinars, and wish you all the best for the day. Thank you.